The rain on Meridian Hollow fell in soft gray sheets, the kind that made the whole world sound like it was breathing, and Sella Vorenkaren stood on the porch of the house she shared with her husband and thought, not for the first time, that she had married the most ordinary human in the galaxy. She meant it fondly. That was the thing people never understood about her, the way she said it. On the trade lanes, on the crowded orbital markets where her people bartered and shouted and preened, ordinary was an insult, a thing you spat at a rival's stall. But Sella had come to hold the word the way one holds a warm cup on a cold morning. Ordinary, unremarkable, safe. Adrian was all of those things, and she loved him for every one of them. She watched him now through the water-blurred window down in the yard, crouched over the irrigation pump that had been coughing and dying all week. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow and mud to the wrist, and his dark hair was plastered flat against his forehead, and he was frowning at a valve the way other men frowned at Scripture. He was 26 years old by the human count. He fixed things. He grew things. He forgot to eat lunch and remembered anniversaries and hummed off-key when he thought no one could hear. He was, by every measure Sella had ever learned to trust, a completely unexceptional young man who had washed up on a farming colony at the quiet edge of settled space and never given her a single reason to think otherwise. Her people, the Karen, were an old species, silver-skinned and long-lived, with eyes that saw further into color than a human's ever could. They were also, by long habit, snobs. When Sella had brought Adrian home to the family station 3 years ago, her mother had studied him the way one studies a stain and asked, in the polite murdering tone only mothers command, what exactly he had done with his life. And Adrian had smiled his easy, embarrassed smile, and said he grew squash and root melon and a hybrid grain that did well in poor soil, and that he'd once won a regional prize for the melons. He'd been very proud of the melons. Her mother had never quite recovered. Sella smiled at the memory. The rain thickened. She pushed open the door and called down into the yard. "You'll drown out there. It's not going anywhere until the storm passes." "Almost," he called back, not looking up. "The seal's gone. If I don't reseed it now, the whole line floods the lower terrace, and then we lose the winter beds, and then we eat protein paste until spring, and then you leave me for a Karen banker who owns a moon." "He'd have to own 2 moons," she said. "One for me and one for the melons." He laughed, that quick, bright sound, and finally the valve gave under his hands with a wet clunk, and the pump shuddered and caught and began to hum its steady, healthy hum, and Adrian sat back on his heels in the mud and rain like a man who had just performed surgery. He looked up at her, grinning, water running off the end of his nose. "See," he said, "ordinary problem. Ordinary fix. Come inside, you ridiculous creature." He came. He tracked mud across the floor she'd cleaned that morning, and she pretended to be furious, and he kissed her temple and smelled of rain and machine oil and the faint green smell of the fields. And for a moment the whole of Sella's world was exactly the size of that kitchen and exactly as bright as she needed it to be. This was the shape of their life. It was a small shape and a good one. Meridian Hollow was a nothing place, and that was its virtue. It sat on the third world of a dim orange star 3 jumps off the nearest real trade route, a colony of maybe 8,000 souls scattered across a temperate belt of river valleys and low hills. Humans and Karen lived there, and a scattering of long-limbed Daeshi who ran the weather station, and a family of Voth who kept the only tavern for 200 kilometers and made a beer that Adrian swore was the finest thing in the galaxy, and that Sella found frankly undrinkable. Nobody came to Meridian Hollow. Nothing happened there. The most exciting event in living memory had been the year the migratory sky eels came in early, and a farmer named Odville had gotten drunk and tried to ride one and broken his arm in 4 places. People still talked about it. That was the kind of place it was. Sella had chosen it on purpose. She did not talk about the years before Meridian Hollow, the years of running cargo through contested lanes, The years of a marriage before this one that had ended the way a glass ends when you drop it, all at once and into pieces too small to gather. She had come here to be no one. And she had found Adrian in the co-op market on a market day, arguing gently with the grain scale, and he had looked up at her and gone briefly and completely still, the way a man goes still when the ground shifts, and then he had smiled and asked if she knew anything about melons. She hadn't, he had taught her. That was the beginning. They had been married 2 years. In that time she had learned the particular geography of him, the way you learn a house in the dark. She knew that he woke before dawn and could not sleep past it. She knew that he had a scar along his left forearm, thin and very old and very straight, that he said was from a harvester blade when he was a boy, and she had believed him because why would she not? She knew that he did not drink much and never got drunk, and that he counted exits in rooms without seeming to, and that when a pot fell in the kitchen he was between her and the sound before the pot had finished falling, and that he laughed all of this off as nervousness, as a jumpy nature, as nothing. She knew, too, the things that did not fit, though she had never let herself line them up and look at them. She was a Karen. She saw color the way humans saw shape, and there was a color to Adrian she had never mentioned to him, a quality under his ordinary brown-eyed ordinary face, something banked and enormous and very still, like the color of deep water over a drop-off, and she had decided, long ago and without ever deciding it, not to look too hard at deep water. You did not look for the bottom of a thing that had given you a home. You just lived on its surface and were grateful for the calm. That night the storm blew itself out and the twin moons came up wet and gold, and they ate the last of the summer beans by lamplight, and Adrian told her a long, ridiculous story about the Voth tavern keeper's youngest son trying to breed a bigger sky eel, and she laughed until her sides hurt and she thought, This is all I want. Let nothing ever be more interesting than this. She should have known better than to think it. The galaxy has a cruel ear for that kind of prayer. It began, as most endings do, with a light in the sky. 3 days after the storm, Sella was in the upper field pulling weather netting off the grain when she saw it, a hard bright point above the eastern hills, too steady to be a star, too fast to be a moon, dropping down through the thin morning cloud on a line that meant landing. She straightened, one hand shading her eyes. Ships came to Meridian Hollow perhaps 4 times a year, the supply hauler and the tax assessor and the itinerant medic, and once a lost pilgrim who'd gotten his coordinates wrong by half a sector. This was none of those. This was too soon and too small and coming down too precisely, and it landed not at the colony strip by the town but out on the old dry flats north of the river, where nothing landed, because there was nothing there. She told Adrian at midday. He was sharpening the long blades for the harvest, drawing the whetstone down the steel in that slow, patient rhythm, and when she described the ship and where it had come down, he did not stop sharpening exactly, but the rhythm changed. Just slightly. The stone paused at the top of one stroke, a half-beat too long, and then came down again perfectly even, and if she had not spent 2 years learning him in the dark, she would never have caught it. Probably a survey team, he said. Prospectors. There's supposed to be trace ore in the flats. They'll be gone in a week. They didn't call the colony. Prospectors never do. They don't want to pay the landing fee. He smiled at her, easy as ever. You worry too much, love. It's the most ordinary thing in the world. Someone came to look at some rocks. She let it go. She wanted to let it go. She had spent 3 years building a life out of letting things go, and she was very good at it. And so she kissed him and went back to the netting and told herself that the strange steadiness she had seen in the sky was only a survey ship, and the strange half-beat in his hands was only a man concentrating on a blade. That was the last wholly ordinary day of Sella Vorenkaren's life, and she did not know it, and that is perhaps a mercy, because if we knew our last ordinary days for what they were, we would never survive them. The strangers came into town 2 days later. There were 3 of them, and they were not prospectors. Prospectors came in from the flats gray with dust, loud, cheerful, thirsty, and they went straight for the Voth's tavern and the beer and the gossip. These three came clean. They came in matched gray coats of a cut Sella had not seen in years, and had hoped never to see again, the long, severe drape of the Concord Survey Service, which was not a survey service at all but had worn that name like a mask for as long as anyone could remember. They were two men and a woman, and they were tall, and they moved through the little market square without haste and without warmth, and they were looking at faces. Sella was at the co-op counter buying thread when they came in, and she felt them enter the way you feel a draft. She kept her eyes on the thread. Some old instinct she had thought long dead stood up inside her and put its hand flat against her chest and said, very quietly, "Do not turn around." She did not turn around. She listened. "We're looking for someone," the woman said. Her voice was pleasant and carrying and completely without kindness. "A human male, young. He'd have come here perhaps 3-4 years ago, alone. Would have wanted to be forgotten." The co-op keeper, an old human named Bess who had run the counter for 40 years and did not care for gray coats, said, "That's half the men on this rock, love. People come here to be forgotten. It's what we're for." "He would have a mark," the woman went on unbothered, "a scar, left forearm, a straight line here to here." Sella heard the rustle of a sleeve, a gesture. "Old, he'll say it's from a farm tool." And Sella Vorenkaran stood at the counter with a spool of thread in her silver hand, and felt the floor of her whole ordinary life go transparent beneath her, and saw, at last, the deep water she had spent 3 years refusing to look at, and understood that she had been standing on it the entire time. She did not turn around. She was proud of that later. She paid for the thread with a hand that did not shake, though she never afterward remembered counting the coins, and she said something to Bess about the weather, and she walked out of the co-op into the ordinary sunlight and did not run, and only when she was 3 streets away, in the shadow of the mill, did she stop and put her back against the wall and let herself breathe. A scar, left forearm, he'll say it's from a farm tool. She had lain beside that scar for 2 years. She had traced it with her fingertip while he slept and thought nothing of it, because he had told her it was nothing, and she had wanted so badly for everything about him to be nothing that she had believed him with her whole heart. And now 3 strangers in Concord gray had walked 400 kilometers of nothing to describe it to a shopkeeper. She thought with a clarity that frightened her, they are not looking for a man. They are looking for a scar. They are looking for a specific old wound on a specific young arm, and they have come all this way, to the end of the map, to find it. Who describes a person by their scars? Only people who have never seen his face. Only people hunting a rumor. Only people who are very, very sure the rumor is worth the hunt. She went home. She did not run, but she went home fast, up the river road with the grain hissing on both sides in the afternoon wind, and she found Adrian in the lower terrace on his knees among the winter beds with dirt on his hands, and he looked up at her and saw her face, and whatever ordinary thing he had been about to say died in his mouth. He stood. He wiped his hands on his trousers, slowly, deliberately, and something in the way he did it, some economy she had never noticed, made the hair stand up along her arms. "Sella," he said, "what happened?" "3 people," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Gray coats, Concord cut in the market, asking after a young human man who came here to be forgotten." She watched his face. She had learned it in the dark, and now she read it in daylight, and it did not change, and that was the most terrifying thing of all, because a truly ordinary man's face would have changed. "They described a scar," she said, "on his left forearm, a straight line, old. They said he'd tell people it came from a farm tool." For a long moment Adrian said nothing at all. The wind moved through the beans. Somewhere down by the river a sky eel called, that low mournful hooting they made, and far off a dog answered it. And then her husband, her ordinary husband who grew melons and forgot lunch and hummed off-key, looked down at his own left forearm, at the thin, straight old white line she had traced 100 times in the dark, and he let out a breath she felt she had been waiting 2 years to hear, and he said, so quietly she almost lost it under the wind. How many ships? Not who are they? Not what did they want? Not are you all right? How many ships? And she understood, standing in the winter beds in the ordinary afternoon light, that she had never once in 3 years seen the bottom of the deep water, and that she was about to. How many ships? Adrian asked again, and this time there was something new under the words, something old and even and terribly patient, a voice she had never heard him use and recognized instantly all the same, the way you recognize a language you spoke as a child. One, Sella said. I saw one small, it came down on the flats. He nodded slowly and looked out over the beans toward the eastern hills, and for a moment he was not looking at the hills at all but at something much further away, something on the other side of years, and Sella watched her husband become, by degrees so small she could not name any single one of them, a stranger. His shoulders did not change. His face did not harden. He did not stand any taller. And yet the man in the winter beds was not the man who had been kneeling there a minute before, and she thought, wildly, that this was what her mother's people meant when they spoke of a color she had never had a word for, a color that was not on the surface of a thing but was the thing, all the way down. One ship means a listening team, he said, almost to himself. They're not sure. If they were sure they'd have sent the fleet. He looked at her. That's good. That means we have a little time. Adrian, her voice cracked on his name, and she hated that it did. Who are you? And her husband, the melon farmer, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them he looked at her with such naked, aching tenderness that it undid her more thoroughly than any strangeness could have. I'm the man who married you, he said. That part was always true. Everything in this house is true, Sella. The melons are true, 2 years of true. I need you to hold on to that because the next few days are going to try very hard to make you think none of it was real, and it was. It was the realest thing I ever did. He drew a breath. But I wasn't born a farmer, and I wasn't always Adrian Cole. And the people in the gray coats have come a very long way to be sure of something, and I'm afraid we can't let them be sure of it. What's your name? He was quiet a moment. Then, the name they're looking for, he said, isn't a name anymore. It's an alarm. If I say it out loud and the wrong instrument is listening, half the fleets in settled space will move at once. So I'm going to ask you to let me not say it. Not to protect me. To protect the 8,000 people who live on this rock and have never done anything to anybody, and who will have the whole weight of the galaxy come down on their heads if that word travels off this world. She stared at him. The wind hissed in the grain. And Sella, who had run cargo through contested lanes, who had lived a whole life before this one, who was not a fool and had never been a fool, made herself say the thing that had been building in her chest since the co-op counter. They think you're dead, she said. Don't they? That's what a listening team is. They think you're dead and something made them wonder and they came to see. Yes. What did you do, Adrian? It came out of her almost as a plea. What did you do that a scar on your arm sends fleets? He looked at her for a long moment, and then, instead of answering, he did something that frightened her more than any answer could have. He began, quietly and methodically, to take their life apart. Pack the gray bag, he said, moving past her toward the house, his voice gone flat and quick and organized. Water for 4 days, the med kit, the good boots, the cold weather layers. Not the good clothes, not the keepsakes, nothing that says who we are. If it can't keep you alive or keep you warm, it stays. He was already at the door. The pump you'll leave running, lamps on their timer. When they come, and they will come, this house has to look like 2 people who stepped out to the fields and will be back by dark. It has to look ordinary. He said the word with a small, terrible smile. You always said I was good at ordinary. Adrian. The Flats team is a scout. They'll ask in town for a day, maybe 2. When they don't get a face, they'll do a low pass with a bioscanner, and my mark, he touched his forearm, is on file somewhere in a machine older than both of us, and if the scanner sees it, they'll be sure, and then it stops being three people in gray coats and starts being something none of us can stop. So we're going to be somewhere else when they fly that pass. We're going up into the high valleys above the scan line where the ore in the rock blinds their machines. 3 days, maybe 4. And with any luck they decide the rumor was nothing and they leave and we come home and I go back to being a man who lost an argument with a grain scale. He stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her and the flatness cracked just for a second, and underneath it was fear, real fear, the first she had ever seen in him. But I need you to move now, and I need you to trust me. I know I have no right to ask you that today of all days. I'm asking anyway. And Sella Vorenkaren looked at her husband and thought of 3 years of letting things go, and understood that this, finally, was the one thing she could not let go of, that whatever he had been, he was hers now, and she was not going to lose a second marriage to gray-coated strangers with a scanner and a file. She went and packed the gray bag. They left before dark. They went up the river road on foot and then off it, onto the herders' tracks that switchbacked into the high country, and Adrian moved through the failing light like a man who had walked 1,000 trails in 100 worse places, quiet, tireless, always half a step ahead, always with his eyes moving. He carried the heavy bag and gave her the light one and would not let her argue about it. When the twin moons rose, he did not stop. When she stumbled on a scree slope in the dark, his hand was under her elbow before she'd finished falling. The same impossible quickness she had explained away for 2 years as jumpiness, as a nervous nature. And now she saw it for what it was and could not unsee it. This was a body trained past thought. This was a man who had been made into something, long ago, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and the melon farmer had been laid over the top of it like turf over stone. They walked most of the night. Near dawn he found them a place, a shallow cave under an overhang where the ore-veined rock came to the surface in great rusty ribs, and he checked the sky twice before he let her sit, and only then, as the first gray light came up over the eastern rim of the world, did he finally sit down himself, his back against the stone, and let out a long breath and become, a little, Adrian again. She sat beside him. She was exhausted and her feet were ruined and her whole understood world had come apart in a single afternoon, and she found, to her surprise, that she was not afraid. She was something else. She was awake in a way she had not been in 3 years. "Tell me," she said, "we have time now. You said we have time. Tell me who I married." He was silent for a long while, watching the light come up. When he spoke, his voice was low and even and stripped of all its farmer's warmth, and she understood that he was speaking in his first language now, the true one, the one under the turf. "There was a war," he said. "You'll have heard of it, though maybe not by the name I knew it by. Everyone your age heard of it. The Long Reach, 20 years ago, a little more." Sella went very still. Of course she had heard of it. Everyone had heard of it. The Long Reach was not a war so much as a wound in the memory of the whole galaxy, the great grinding conflict that had begun out past the frontier, when the Concord's expansion had met something coming the other way, something old and vast and hungry that had eaten frontier worlds the way a tide eats a sandcastle. Whole systems had gone dark. Whole species had fled inward, refugees stacked in orbital camps, and the Concord had thrown fleet after fleet at the dark, and the fleets had not come back. And for 3 terrible years it had looked as though the light itself was in retreat, as though the map of the living galaxy was simply going to keep shrinking until there was nothing left to defend. And then it had stopped. That was the part everyone remembered and no one could quite explain. It had stopped. The tide had turned, out past the frontier where no journalist and no camera could go, and the dark had broken and rolled back, and the frontier had held, and the war had ended not in a treaty but in a silence, and the galaxy had exhaled and rebuilt and tried very hard to forget how close it had come. "You were in it," she said. "You were a soldier in the Long Reach." Adrian shook his head slowly, and there was no pride in it at all, only a great weariness. "No," he said, I wasn't a soldier in it, Sella. He looked at her, and the dawn was in his ordinary brown eyes, and for one dizzying instant she saw all the way down. I was the reason it stopped. The words fell into the morning and lay there, too large to pick up. That's not, she stopped, started again. One person doesn't stop a war. No, he agreed. One person doesn't, but the long reach didn't end because of an army, Sella. It couldn't. You can't out-army a thing that eats worlds. There aren't enough worlds. It ended because of one thing the enemy couldn't build and couldn't buy and couldn't eat, and that was a person willing to walk into the dark alone and do a thing that could not be undone. He was quiet. They needed someone to carry it in. The weapon, if you can even call it that, it wasn't a weapon like you're thinking. It was a key. A key to a door that had been left in the deep of their space by something older than either side, and behind the door was the thing that turned the tide, and it could only be carried by one person, on foot, past everything they had, because anything larger than one person the dark could see coming and swallow. It was a coin toss with the galaxy on the coin, and they needed someone young enough to make the crossing and stubborn enough to finish it and expendable enough to send. He smiled, without humor. I was 17 when they found me. I was very good at the things they needed, and I had no one who would miss me, and both of those things made me perfect. Sella could not breathe. She thought of the scar on his arm. She thought of a boy of 17 walking alone into the thing that had eaten star systems, and something in her chest folded up small and hard. You carried it in, she whispered. I carried it in, and it worked. The door opened and the tide turned and the long reach ended. He looked down at his own hands, the farmer's hands, the calloused ordinary hands that had receded a valve in the rain. And the galaxy needed a story it could hold because a frightened boy walked into the dark and something ancient answered is not a story that lets people sleep. So they made me into something else. They gave me a name that wasn't mine and a face on 10,000 monuments, and a legend with a beginning and a middle, and a heroic shining end. And then, when the war was over and the wars that come after wars began, when the conquered started to think about what a person who could do the undoable might be worth pointed the other way, his jaw tightened. I did the only thing I had left that they hadn't scripted. I died. On paper. I let the legend have its shining end. And I walked off the map and I never looked back. And I grew squash and root melon at the edge of nowhere, and I met a silver-eyed woman arguing with the wrong scale, and I was, for 2 years, exactly as ordinary as I have ever wanted anything to be in my life. The sun cleared the ridge. Light poured down the valley, gold and ordinary, over a world that did not know that the boy who had turned back the dark was sitting in a cave inside it, holding his wife's hand, waiting for the gray coats to give up and go home. What was the name? Sella said softly. The one on the monuments, the one that's an alarm now. Adrian was quiet a long time. Then, so quietly that she had to lean in, so quietly that the wind almost took it, he told her. And though it meant nothing to her ear, though it was only a sound, she saw the color of it come up in him as he said it, that deep-water color she had spent 3 years refusing to look at, and she understood at last that it had never been a shadow in him. It had been light. It had been light the whole time, banked and hidden and enormous, and she had been living beside a covered lamp and calling the dimness peace. They think you're dead, she said again, slowly feeling her way. So if they see your face. If they confirm I'm alive, Adrian said, then every power in the galaxy that has ever wanted a person who can do the impossible will want to own me, or use me, or make sure no one else does. The conquered will want their weapon back. Their enemies will want it destroyed. And a great many people who slept better believing the legend was safely dead will lie awake again. He turned to her. That's why the galaxy goes on alert, Sella. Not because of what I might do, because of what I am. A door that everyone thought was closed forever, and someone just heard a sound behind it. Down in the valley, very small and very far, a light rose off the northern flats and began, slowly, to climb. Adrian saw it the same instant she did. He was on his feet without seeming to have stood, drawing her back into the shadow of the overhang, and every trace of the farmer was gone from him. And what stood in the cave mouth in his place watched that climbing light with the flat, still, ancient attention of the thing under the turf. "That's the low pass," he said quietly. "Right on schedule, stay in the rock, don't move until I say." The light climbed and turned and began to sweep west along the scan line, toward the high valleys, toward the ore-blind country, toward them. They pressed themselves into the deepest fold of the rock, and they did not move. The scout ship came up the valley low and slow, and it was an ugly thing, all sensor blisters and antenna masts, a machine built for one purpose, which was to find. It flew a search grid back and forth, patient as a plow, and each pass brought it a little further west and a little further up, and Sella could hear the thin whine of it now, and under the whine a second sound, a soft rhythmic pulse she felt in her teeth more than heard, and Adrian's hand tightened on her arm and he breathed, so low it was barely words, "Bioscan. Don't think about your name. Don't think about mine. Think about the rock." She thought about the rock. She thought about it with everything she had, the rusty ore-veined rock, the cold of it against her back, the weight of 1,000,000,000 years pressing them both into anonymity, and the ship crawled overhead, and the pulse went through her teeth, and she waited for the whine to change, for the machine to find the mark on her husband's arm through the stone, for the alarm. It did not come. The ore did its blind work. The scanner's pulse washed over a mountainside full of nothing, a mountainside of rock and rust and two more shapes of rock among the rocks, and the ship finished its grid and hung a moment at the head of the valley, as if disappointed, as if it could smell something it could not see, and then it turned and slid back down toward the flats and was gone. Neither of them moved for a long time. "Is it over?" Sella whispered at last. "No," Adrian said, "but we're not on their list of certainties anymore, and that buys us the thing we need most, which is doubt. A listening team runs on certainty. Give them doubt and they get bored and expensive and their masters call them home." He let out a breath, and by slow degrees some of the farmer came back into him, into his shoulders, into his eyes. "One more day up here, maybe two. We let them come up empty, we let the doubt do its work, and then we go home, and we plant the winter beds, and we grow old, and none of this ever happened." He looked at her and tried to smile and did not quite manage it. "I'm sorry, Sella. I'm sorry I never told you. I told myself it was to keep you safe. And it was. But it was also because I liked the man you thought I was, and I was afraid that if you knew, you'd stop being able to see him." Sella looked at her husband, at the boy who had walked into the dark, at the melon farmer, at both of them at once, finally, in the same face, and she reached out and put her silver hand against his cheek. "I still see him," she said. "He's the same man. He fixes the pump. He forgets lunch. He put his hand under my elbow before I'd finished falling, both today and every day for 2 years, and I called it clumsiness because I was afraid of the truth. And the truth is I married a man who walks toward the thing everyone else runs from. I've been married to that man the whole time. I just have a better name for him now." She held his eyes. "And it isn't the name on the monuments. It's Adrian. That one's mine. They can't have it." He put his hand over hers and held it against his face and closed his eyes, and for a moment the fearsome thing under the turf was only a young man very far from home who had been alone with something too heavy for one person to carry, and had carried it anyway, and had never once been allowed to set it down. She held him. The wind moved through the high country. Far below, the light of the scout ship sat cold on the flats, waiting, and did not know how close it had come. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it, because certainty is a thing that can arrive by more roads than one, and while the gray coats sat on the flats losing faith in their rumor, the rumor was already loose in the wider dark, traveling the way all dangerous things travel, on the tongues of frightened people. It had begun, though neither of them would learn this until later, with the supply hauler. The hauler that came to Meridian Hollow 4 times a year had a chatty pilot, a Dashi named who ran his gossip up and down the quiet lanes the way a bee runs pollen. And 3 weeks ago, over a beer at the Voth's Tavern, had been talking, as he always talked, and the melon farmer, as he always did, had helped him carry a jammed cargo pallet, and had freed the jam with a single unthinking economical motion that no farmer's body should have known. And who had flown supply runs during the long reach and had seen soldiers move, had felt a cold finger touch the back of his neck, and had said nothing, and had thought about it all the way to the next port, and had, at last, in a bar far away, told the story of the melon farmer who moved like a ghost. And someone in that bar had been the kind of someone who listens for ghosts, and had made a call, and that was the road by which 3 gray coats had come to Meridian Hollow. But it was also the road by which something else had come, because there is more than one kind of listener in the dark. And while the Concord's listening team sat losing their nerve on the northern flats, another party, faster and colder and far less patient, had heard the same ghost story and drawn the same line to the same dim orange star, and they had not sent a scout. Sella and Adrian came down out of the high country on the 3rd morning, when the scout ship had at last lifted off the flats and climbed away east and vanished. Its team, as Adrian had predicted, bored and out of faith, and recalled by masters who had better uses for gray coats than chasing a farmer's shadow at the edge of the map. They came down the herder's tracks tired and filthy and quietly, unbearably happy, and they talked the whole way about ordinary things, the winter beds, the pump, whether the sky eels had come, and by the time they reached the river road in the late afternoon, Sella had almost let herself believe it was over. Then they crested the last rise and saw the smoke. It was not much smoke. That was the terrible thing, later in memory. It was not a burning town, not a massacre, not the great violence she had braced for. It was one thin column rising from the far side of the valley, from the direction of the northern flats, and it was black and greasy and wrong, and Adrian stopped on the rise and looked at it and went absolutely still, and Sella watched the last of the farmer drain out of him like water out of a cracked jug. "That's the scout ship," he said quietly, "or what's left of it." "You said they left. You said they lifted off." "They lifted off," Adrian said, "and someone shot them down. He was already moving fast down the rise, and she scrambled after him. The Concord team wasn't the only one hunting the ghost, Sella. And whoever the other hunter is, they were watching the same sky I was, and they saw the scout give up and leave, and they decided that a Concord listening team leaving empty-handed was the last thing they wanted to allow, because a Concord team that stays uncertain and goes home keeps the secret buried. They didn't want the secret buried. They wanted it confirmed, and confirmed to them alone, and so they made sure the only other party that could confirm it will never file a report." He reached the bottom of the rise and turned to her, and his face was grim and old and utterly certain. "They just told me everything I needed to know. The Concord came to see if the ghost was real. These people already believe he's real. They didn't come to look. They came to collect." "Collect who?" "Me," Adrian said, "and they'll take this whole town apart to do it." They ran. They ran for the house, because the house was where the gray bag was, and the med kit, and the little that stood between them and the mountains, and because some animal part of Sella needed to see her home whole one more time before whatever was coming came. They ran up the river road in the long gold light with the grain hissing on both sides, and the thin black column climbed the sky behind them. And the town, when they reached the edge of it, was quiet and ordinary and utterly ignorant. Children in the square, Bess closing the co-op shutters, the Voth boy chasing a sky eel hatchling with a net, 8,000 souls going about the end of a nothing day at the end of the map. And not one of them knew that a thing they had never heard of had come to their world to take a man they thought grew melons. Adrian slowed at the edge of the square. He caught Sella's arm and pulled her into the shadow of the mill, breathing hard, his eyes going everywhere. "Listen to me," he said. "Listen, because I'm only going to say it once and we don't have long. The people who shot down that scout are professionals. Salvagers, most likely, or a private acquisition crew, the kind that works the gap between the conquered and its enemies and sells to whoever pays. They'll come into this town the way they came onto that ship, fast and hard, and without caring who's standing in the way. And the only thing in the whole galaxy that will make them careful. He stopped, and something crossed his face, some enormous reluctance, some door he had spent 20 years holding shut and now had his hand on the latch of. The only thing that will make a crew like that stop and think and choose, very carefully, not to burn a town to the ground, is if they learn that the ghost they came to collect is not a rumor and not a farmer and not a frightened boy anymore. If they learn that the thing behind the door is awake. Sella stared at him. You said the name is an alarm. You said if it travels off this world. It's already off this world, Adrian said. That's what the smoke means. It's too late to keep it buried. The only question left is who finds out and how, and whether these 8,000 people survive the finding out. He looked at her and there was grief in him and fear, and under both of them rising, the deep water light coming up and up and up, no longer banked, no longer hidden, filling him to the eyes. I spent 20 years being dead so that no one would ever have to be afraid of me again. And now the only way to keep these people alive is to be the thing they were afraid of. One more time. His voice went very low. I need you to understand what you're about to see, Sella. I need you to understand that it's still me. Whatever they say about the man in the monuments, whatever the gray coats machines scream when they finally see my face, it's still the man who fixed the pump. Hold on to that. I'm going to need someone to hold on to that, because I'm about to remind the galaxy that its ghost is alive, and once I do, there's no going back to the melons. And then from the north over the flats came a new sound, the deep, ground-shaking, world-ending thunder of a dropship coming down fast and heavy, engines howling, coming to collect. Sella looked at her husband. The farmer was gone. What stood beside her in the mill's shadow was the boy who had walked into the dark and the man who had walked out of it and the legend the whole galaxy had mourned, all at once, in one ordinary young face. And it turned toward the sound of the dropship with no fear in it at all, only a terrible, quiet, ancient purpose. Get the town into the mill cellars, he told her. Every soul. Best knows the way. Tell her I said the old flood drill, she'll understand. Get them underground and keep them there and do not come out no matter what you hear. No matter what you hear, Sella. What are you going to do? Adrian looked at the descending fire in the northern sky and rolled up his left sleeve, bearing the thin, straight old scar to the gold light, the mark they had crossed the map to find. I'm going to go meet them, he said, and I'm going to tell them my name. Sella did not want to leave him. Every part of her rebelled against it, against turning her back on him in the mill's shadow with the sky coming down. But he took her face in both his hands and pressed his forehead to hers hard and said, The town, Sella. You're the only one who can move them fast because you're the only one who will believe me. Go, please. Let me do the one thing I know how to do, and let me do it knowing you're safe. And she understood that he was right, that 8,000 people were about to be standing in the path of something and that she could put them out of it, and that this was the mercy she could give him. To take the innocent out of his reach so that he could be, for a little while longer, the thing that stood between them and the dark. She kissed him. It tasted of mountain dust and machine oil and 2 years of true. Then she turned and ran into the square, and she began to scream the flood drill. Bess did understand. Old Bess, who had run the co-op for 40 years, took one look at Sella's face and did not ask a single question, and her voice, cracked as it was, carried like a bell across the square, and 40 years of standing had made this town trust her, and it moved. The old flood drill was in everyone's bones, drilled into them since childhood by the river's spring rages, and the mill cellars were deep and old and stone, and the town poured into them, children first, then the old, then everyone, Daisy and Voth and Karen and human, 8,000 souls funneling down into the dark. And Sella stood at the cellar mouth and pushed them through and counted and called and did not let herself look north, did not let herself look at the fire coming down. until the very last of them was underground and the great old flood doors were swinging shut. And then, only then, she looked. The dropship had landed in the square. It was black and scarred, and it crouched over the market stalls like a beetle over crumbs, and its ramp was down, and figures were coming off it, 8-10. A dozen, hard-suited and helmeted and armed with the casual heavy weaponry of people who had never in their lives been made to stop. And at their center walked a tall figure in matte black armor chased with silver, unhurried, a commander surveying a purchase. Their guns swept the empty square, the shuttered stalls, the abandoned nets, the sky-eel hatchling nosing forlornly at a dropped ball, and finding nothing, and the tall commander lifted a helmet, revealing a lean, scarred face, and spoke, and the voice came out amplified and bored across the emptiness. "We know he's here. We tracked the conquered team to this rock and we watched them come up empty, which means he's better at hiding than they are at looking, which means he's exactly what we came for." The commander turned slowly, addressing the shuttered town. "You've got a man here, grows melons, came 4 years back. We're going to take him with us and we'll pay for the trouble if you're reasonable and we'll level the trouble if you're not. You've got until I count to something short." And Sella, crouched in the cellar mouth with the flood door half shut against her back, saw her husband walk out into the square. He came from the shadow of the mill, unhurried, his sleeve rolled to the elbow, his hands loose and empty at his sides, and he was the most ordinary-looking man in the galaxy, dark-haired and dirt-stained and young, and he walked out into the open square in front of a dozen guns as though he were walking out to argue with a grain scale. And something about that, the sheer wrongness of a small, unarmed farmer strolling toward a dropship crew, made every one of those guns swing toward him and hold. The commander looked at him. "That's far enough, you him." "Depends who you're looking for," Adrian said. His voice was easy, almost friendly, and it carried in the still square, and Sella, who had learned it in the dark, heard the thing underneath it now, the flat, even ancient thing, and shivered. "There's a man here who grows melons. That's true. That's me. If that's who you want, you've got him, and you can put the guns down because he's not going to give you any trouble." "Good," said the commander. "Smart, cuff him." 2 of the hard suits started forward. "But," Adrian said, and something in the single soft syllable stopped them, "you didn't cross the map for a melon farmer. You shot a conquered ship out of the sky for a melon farmer. Men don't do that. So you're not looking for the man who grows melons." He kept walking slowly into the center of the square, into the center of the guns, and he lifted his left arm and he turned it, and he showed them the scar, the thin, straight, old white line, catching the gold light. "You're looking for this." The square went very quiet. Sella watched the commander's scarred face change. She watched the boredom fall off it. She watched something come into it that she recognized, because she had felt it herself 3 days ago at the co-op counter. The sensation of a floor going transparent, of standing on deep water and seeing for the first time that it had a bottom, and that the bottom was very far down, and that something was moving on it. "Scan him," the commander said, and the amplified boredom was gone from the voice now, replaced by something clipped and careful. One of the hard suits raised a scanner. It pulsed. Sella felt it even from the cellar mouth, that soft rhythm in the teeth. It pulsed, and it read the mark on the arm against a file in a machine older than either of them, and it found what it found, and the hard suit holding it went utterly still, and then said in a voice that cracked inside the helmet, a single word. It was the name on the monuments, the name that was an alarm. And the whole square seemed to flinch. The dozen guns did not lower. They came up higher, and they were suddenly, visibly, not as steady as they had been, and the hard suits had spread instinctively into a loose defensive ring, not around Adrian but away from him, giving ground, the way you give ground to a fire that has just caught, and the commander stood alone in the center of it all and looked at the small dirt-stained young man in front of the dropship and said slowly, disbelievingly, "That's not possible. He's dead. He's been dead 20 years. There are monuments." "There are," Adrian agreed. "I've seen them. They're not very good likenesses." He lowered his arm. He stood there, small and unarmed and ordinary, in the center of a ring of the most dangerous people on the world, and he was the calmest thing in the square. You have a choice to make, and I'm going to make it very simple for you because I don't want to hurt anyone today, and I'm hoping you don't either. You came here to collect a ghost and sell it, but a ghost is only worth something if it's a rumor. The moment your scanner said that word out loud, it stopped being a rumor. Your ship logged it. Your scanner logged it. And a crew like yours doesn't run silent. You've got a relay burst set to fire your position, and your findings home the second things go wrong, because that's how crews like yours stay alive. Which means that word is already climbing off this rock on a tight beam, right now, whether you want it to or not. He tilted his head. You didn't confirm a secret you could sell. You rang a bell the whole galaxy is listening for. And in about the time it takes light to cross a few sectors, every fleet, every listening post, every power that fought the long reach and every power that's been waiting for a second one is going to know that the ghost is alive. And they're going to know exactly where, because you told them. Sella watched the commander understand it. She watched it move across the scarred face like a shadow crossing a field. The crew had come to steal a secret in the dark, and by the simple act of confirming it, they had broadcast it and turned their quiet, lucrative acquisition into the single most watched patch of space in the settled galaxy, and made themselves not the hunters but a dozen people standing next to the most wanted man alive with a target now painted on the ground beneath their feet. You've got maybe an hour, Adrian said gently, before the sky fills up with people who want what you came for and won't be nearly as reasonable as you were about the melon farmer. Conquered fast response. Whoever your rivals are. Whoever's been keeping a fleet warm for 20 years just in case the ghost ever came back. They're all coming here now to this square, and they are going to arrive angry and frightened and heavily armed, and the only people standing in the middle of it will be you. He let that sit. So here is my offer, and it's the only one I've got. Get on your ship. Fire a second burst right now and correct the first one. Say it was a false read. Say the ghost is dust, the rumor's dead, the farmer's just a farmer. Muddy it. You're professionals. You know how to poison a signal. Give them doubt instead of certainty. And then leave and never come back and never say this world's name again. Do that, and you live, and this town lives, and the sky stays empty. It's the best deal anyone's offered you in years, and it expires the moment I stop talking. For a long, long moment the square hung in the balance. A dozen guns, one small man. And Sella in the cellar mouth understood at last, fully in her bones, what her husband was and what the word meant, and why the galaxy would go on alert to hear it. Not because of what he might do to them, but because he was the one thing their whole ordered, fearful galaxy could not account for, a person who had walked into the impossible and walked back out, and who could, if he chose, do it again, and no fleet in the dark could stop him, and everyone knew it, including the dozen professionals now realizing that they had cornered not a prize but an avalanche. The commander looked at the small young man. The commander looked at the empty sky that would not be empty for long. And the commander, who had survived a long career precisely by knowing when a job had gone wrong past saving, made the only choice a professional could make. Back to the ship, the commander said hoarsely, all of you now. They went. They went fast and not entirely in order, and more than one of them kept their gun on the small dirt-stained man the whole way up the ramp, as though he might at any moment become the thing the word promised, and Adrian stood in the center of the square with his empty hands at his sides and let them go, and did not move, and did not so much as raise his voice, and that stillness was more frightening to them than any violence could have been. The ramp came up. The engines howled. The black dropship lifted off the ruined market stalls and climbed, and Sella heard, or imagined she heard, the thin shriek of a tight beam firing, a second burst chasing the first out into the dark, a lie, a muddying doubt sent to drown certainty. And then the ship was a point of light, and then it was gone, and the square was empty, and the sky-eel hatchling nosed the dropped ball, and Adrian Cole stood alone in the gold evening light exactly where the melon farmer had always stood. Sella came up out of the cellar and ran to him across the empty square, and he caught her and held her, and he was shaking, she realized, shaking finally all over. Now that it was done, now that there was no one left to see the ghost be afraid. And she held him in the middle of the square, in the wreck of the market, and behind them the great flood doors began to open, and 8,000 souls began, slowly, wonderingly, to climb back up into the light of their ordinary world, not one of them yet understanding what had just been decided over their heads, or by whom. But it was not over, because a lie sent to chase the truth does not always run fast enough, and far out in the dark, the first burst had already been heard. The town did not understand what it had survived. That was the strangest part of the days that followed, stranger even than the news the tavern comset began to carry. That 8,000 people had stood in a stone cellar, while the shape of the whole galaxy's next 20 years was decided in the square above their heads, and had come up into the evening light knowing only that some crew of off-world salvagers had come, made threats, and left. They gathered in the ruined market and picked up the fallen stalls and murmured to one another about pirates, about the boldness of it, about how lucky they'd been that the strangers had lost their nerve. Bess said the melon farmer had talked them down, that she'd seen it from the cellar mouth, the young man just walking out and talking, and the town nodded and marveled at his courage and could not, imagine what the talking had actually been, and Adrian let them believe it. He helped right the stalls. He caught the sky eel hatchling and gave it back to the Voth boy. He was once more the most ordinary man in the galaxy, and only Sella, watching him from across the square, could see how much the ordinariness cost him now, how carefully he wore it, like a coat over a wound. "They can never know," he said to her that night. "It isn't safety I'm protecting anymore, that's gone, it's them. If this town starts telling the story of what really happened here, the story travels, and a traveling story is what brought the gray coats in the first place. The doubt I bought in the square only holds if nobody down here ever gives the galaxy a reason to be certain. So they get to be lucky. They get to have survived some pirates. It's the kindest lie I know how to tell." He was quiet a moment. "I've told a lot of them, kind lies. It turns out that's most of what a legend is." They did not sleep that night, either of them. They lay in the dark and listened to the pump hum its steady, healthy hum, and Sella held his hand and traced the scar in the dark the way she had for 2 years. Only now she knew what it was, and it did not frighten her, and somewhere over their heads, though they could not know it yet, the first burst was still climbing outward through the dark, faster than the lie that chased it, and it had not yet been overtaken. It reached the nearest conquered fast response element on the second morning. They did not learn the alarm had jumped from the tavern comset. The news lagged the truth by hours in a place this remote. They learned it the way they had learned everything, from the sky. Sella was hanging the washing in the gray dawn when she saw the light, and she knew at once it was different from the scout, different from the dropship, because it did not come down slow and searching or fast and heavy. It came down like judgment, a hard white blade of a ship, all clean lethal lines and conquered blazon, decelerating on a column of fire so bright it threw her shadow long across the yard, and it did not land on the flats or in the square. It landed in the field, in their field. In the upper field where the grain stood, flattening a black circle of it under its landing burn, close enough that the heat of it touched her face across the fence. Adrian was beside her, before she had dropped the washing. "Conquered," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Fast response cutter." "That's a war machine, Sella, not a salvage tub." The first burst beat the lie. Someone at high command heard the name and didn't wait for confirmation. He looked at the cutter, at the ramp lowering, at the figures forming up at its foot, hard and precise and disciplined in a way the salvagers had never been, conquered Marines in full battle plate, and at their center a single unarmored figure in the deep gray of the command service. This is different. The salvagers were professionals. They could be reasoned into leaving because leaving was in their interest. These people don't want profit. They want their weapon back. And there is nothing in the galaxy harder to reason with than a frightened government that thinks it's found something it lost. Then we run, Sella said. The mountains, the ore like before. They tracked me to a farmhouse from 3 sectors away in 2 days, Adrian said gently. The scout was fishing. This is a scalpel. There's no ore deep enough now. He turned to her and took her hands, and for a moment the ancient thing under the turf was set aside entirely, and it was only Adrian, only her husband, holding her hands in the gray dawn with a war machine burning in his field. There's only one card left, Sella, and I'm going to have to play it, and I need you to trust me one more time. I'm not going to run, and I'm not going to fight. I'm going to do the thing I'm actually good at, the thing they made me for before they made me a soldier. I'm going to talk. And I'm going to need you to stand where they can see you and be exactly what you are, ordinary. A wife. Proof that the ghost is just a man. It's the most important thing you'll ever do, and all you have to do is stand there and let them see that I have something to lose. The gray figure came across the field toward the fence, Marines fanning out behind, weapons ready but not raised, and stopped a few paces off, and studied them both with pale, tired eyes. It was an old human, older than Adrian by decades, with a soldier's bearing gone stooped, and a face that had seen the long reach and never entirely come home from it. For a long moment the officer said nothing. And then, in a voice rusty with disbelief, the old soldier spoke a name, the name on the monuments, the name that was an alarm, as a question, as a prayer, as an accusation, and Sella watched the old face crumble and reassemble around it. "They told us you were dead," the officer said. "I carried your coffin. It was empty. I always knew it was empty, we all knew, but I carried it because the boys needed something to carry. And now a listening filter that hasn't twitched in 20 years lights up on a salvage burst from the edge of nowhere, and I'm ordered to come and confirm, and I come. And here you are, standing in a bean field, and you haven't aged a day past the boy we sent into the dark." The old man's jaw worked. "How?" "I've aged," Adrian said quietly. "Just not where you can see it." He did not deny the name. He did not confirm it. He stood at his own fence in the dawn light, small and dirt-stained and unarmed, and he looked at the old soldier who had carried his empty coffin, and something passed between the two of them that Sella could not read, some freight of the war, some debt in a currency she had never had to spend. "You know what happens now, Colonel. You know it better than I do. You've had 20 years to think about it, and I've had 2 days. You confirm me, and you take me back, and the conquered has its weapon again. And every enemy the conquered has ever made learns the same day that the ghost is real and in conquered hands, and they will not wait to see what you do with me. They'll move first. You'll have started the second war trying to win the first one twice." He let that settle. "You didn't come here to start a war, Colonel. You came because a machine told you to, and because some part of you needed to know if the boy you sent into the dark had made it out. Well, here's your answer. He made it out. He's standing in a bean field with dirt on his hands and a wife who thinks the beans are more important than any of this, and she's right." He glanced at Sella and back. "Let him stay dead, Colonel. It's the only version of this that doesn't end in fire." The old soldier looked at Sella then, truly looked at her silver skin and her ordinary work-worn hands and the fallen washing at her feet, and something moved behind the tired eyes. Sella held his gaze and did not flinch and did not speak, and she let him see it, all of it, the 2 years of true, the ordinary mourning, the woman who wanted her husband and not a legend. And she watched the old man understand that the weapon he had come to reclaim had, somewhere in the long silence, become a person, and that a person is a very much harder thing to carry off in a coffin than a weapon is. "If I go back and tell them it was a false read," the colonel said slowly, "they won't believe me, not all of them. Some of them have wanted you back for 20 years and they'll keep looking." "Some of them always will," Adrian agreed. "But they'll be looking for a ghost, and a ghost is easy to doubt. Tell them the burst was a salvage cruise mistake, a scanner ghost, a name misread off an old file. Tell them you came and found a farming colony and a scared population and nothing else. Muddy it, Colonel, you know how. And every year that passes without me surfacing again, the doubt gets a little deeper until the ones who wanted me back are old and dead, and the ones who come after only half believe the story their fathers told them. That's how a legend dies for real, not in a coffin, in doubt. He paused. You can be the man who buries it, or you can be the man who starts the next long reach. That's the whole of the choice, and I think you made it before your ramp came down, or you'd have led with the Marines instead of my name. The dawn wind moved across the flattened grain. The Marines stood, weapons low, watching their colonels back, and did not understand what they were watching any more than the town in the cellar had understood. And that, Sella thought, was the shape of her husband's whole life, standing at the center of enormous things and being understood by almost no one, and choosing, every time, the quiet that cost him the most. The old soldier looked at the ghost a long time. Then, stiffly, with the ache of decades in it, he straightened to something like attention, and he did not salute, because a salute would have been a confirmation, and instead he simply inclined his head, the smallest bow, a private thing between two men who had each carried something impossible for the other. The boy we sent into the dark, the colonel said quietly, deserved to come home to something. I'm glad he did. He glanced at Sella, and the ghost of a smile touched the tired mouth. Mind the beans, then. I'll tell them it was nothing. I'll tell them the ghost is dust. He turned to go and paused and did not look back. For what it's worth, and it's worth nothing, and I'll deny I ever said it. Thank you for the crossing. We never got to say it. We put it on a monument instead, and a monument can't hear. And then he walked back across the field to his war machine, and the Marines folded in behind him, and the ramp came up, and the white cutter lifted off the flattened grain on its column of fire and climbed into the brightening sky and was gone, carrying home a lie that a tired old soldier would spend the rest of his life defending. Sella let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the scout first crossed the sky. Her legs were shaking. Adrian caught her, the way he always caught her before she had finished falling, and she leaned into him in the ruined field with the washing scattered at their feet and the black scorched circle smoking in the grain, and she began, helplessly, to laugh, because it was that or weep, and because the beans, somehow absurdly, were still standing at the edge of the burn. He thanked you, she said into his chest. A conquered colonel came down in a war machine and thanked you and then lied to his own government to keep you, and the town thinks it was pirates. And the galaxy, she lifted her head. What is the galaxy doing right now, Adrian? Really? While you're standing in a scorched bean field. And Adrian Cole looked up at the brightening sky, at the fading fire of the cutter, at the vast unseen dark beyond it, where the first burst was still racing outward ahead of every lie sent to catch it, and his ordinary face was very still. Right now, he said quietly, right now, love, I think the galaxy is waking up. It reached the conquered relay station at Harker's Drift first, because Harker's Drift was closest, an old military listening post 3 sectors coreward that had spent 20 years doing almost nothing, its skeleton crew growing gardens in the hydroponics bay and playing long, slow games of chance and forgetting, mostly, what they were listening for. The night shift officer, a bored young Dashi named Tavel, was the one who caught it. It came in as a routine intercept, a salvage cruise relay burst, the kind of low-priority chatter the station's machines swept up by the thousand and filed and forgot. But this one tripped a filter, an old filter. A filter that had been set into the deep code of every conquered listening post 2 decades ago and had never once in all that time so much as twitched. A filter keyed to a single string of sound, a single name, the name that was not a name anymore but an alarm. Tavel saw the alert bloom red across the board and did not, at first, understand it. There was no protocol he had ever been trained on for that particular red. He had to call up a file older than his commission to even learn what it meant. And when he read it, when he understood which name his machines had just heard spoken aloud on a live intercept from a nothing world at the edge of the map, the young Dashi felt the same floor go transparent beneath him that had opened under Sella at the co-op counter, and under the salvage commander in the square, and he did the only thing the ancient file told him to do. He raised the alarm. And here is the thing about the galaxy, the great, terrible, ordered, fearful galaxy, that Sella had never understood until the night she watched it happen from a farmhouse porch. It had been waiting. For 20 years, without ever admitting it, without ever putting it in a budget or a briefing, it had been waiting for this exact sound. Every power that had lived through the long reach had built its quiet contingencies against the day the ghost came back, had kept a fleet warm somewhere, a protocol filed, a filter set, because a person who had done the undoable once might do it again, and no throne in the dark could rest easy while such a person walked the map. And when Harker's Drift lit up, the alarm did not stay at Harker's Drift. It jumped. Relay to relay, post to post, throne to throne, the name crossed the settled galaxy in a widening ring of light, and everywhere it touched, something ancient and afraid woke up. The conquered High Command went to its highest alert for the first time since the war. Fleets that had sat at anchor for 2 decades lighting their engines in the space of an hour. Not to attack. Not even the admirals could have said to attack what, but simply to move, to be moving, toward the source. Their old enemies out past the frontier caught the same ring of light and read it the same way and answered it in kind, and long Cold War fleets stirred in the deep dark and turned their faces coreward. Neutral powers scrambled to close their borders and open their listening ears. Trade lanes froze, markets convulsed. On 10,000 worlds in 10,000 tongues, the same impossible sentence began to travel from mouth to mouth. The ghost is alive, the one who turned back the dark. He was never dead, he's back. And nobody, in all that vast waking galaxy, in all those turning fleets and frozen lanes and convulsing markets, knew what he actually wanted, because the answer would have made no sense to a single one of them. He wanted to plant the winter beds. Sella learned all of this in pieces over the days that followed, from the town's one old comset in the Voth's tavern, which crackled now day and night with news the like of which Meridian Hollow had never heard. Sectors going to alert, fleets moving, the name, always the name, spoken by frightened newsreaders who did not know they were describing a man 3 jumps away kneeling in a garden. The salvage crew's second burst had gone out, the lie, the muddying, and it had done its small work. The galaxy knew the name had been heard, but the follow-up said false read, dust, a farmer, nothing, and so certainty curdled into doubt, and the fleets that had lit their engines had somewhere to send them but nothing to be sure of when they arrived, and the great alert, deprived of a target it could trust, began, slowly, over weeks, to bank itself back down toward the long, uneasy sleep it had kept for 20 years. A ghost that might have come back and might not. A rumor confirmed and then unconfirmed. A door that had made a sound and then gone quiet again. The galaxy could live with that. The galaxy had lived with that for 2 decades. It went back to living with it, and its fleets stood down, one by one, and the trade lanes thawed and the markets steadied, and the impossible sentence faded from 10,000 tongues back into legend, where the frightened prefer their ghosts to stay. But it had happened. For a handful of days, the whole of settled space had gone on high alert, thrones and fleets and worlds without number, all of them turning at once toward a single dim orange star, all of them woken by a single word, and the word had been the true name of a man who, in the middle of all of it, at the eye of the storm he had raised simply by existing, had gone home and washed the mountain dust off his hands, and asked his wife if she thought it was too late in the season to get the beans in. They stood on the porch on the evening the last of it faded, when the tavern comset had finally stopped crackling the name and gone back to weather and grain prices, and the rain came down again in its soft gray sheets, and the whole world sounded once more like it was breathing. "They'll never be entirely sure," Adrian said quietly, watching the rain. "That's the best I could do. Doubt. Not safety, not ever again, not really, but doubt. As long as they're not sure, they won't come. And a place like this at the edge of the map, 3 jumps from anywhere, it's a very easy place to be not sure about." He looked at her and there was an apology in it and a question. "It's not the life I promised you, the ordinary one. I can't give you that anymore. I gave it away in the square." "I'm sorry." Sella looked at her husband, the melon farmer, the boy who had walked into the dark. The ghost the galaxy had turned its fleets to find, all of them in one ordinary young face wet with rain. And she found that she was not afraid and had not been afraid since the cave, and understood at last that she never would be again, because she had seen the bottom of the deep water now, and it had not been a monster. It had been a lamp. "I never wanted the ordinary one," she said. "I wanted you. I just didn't know how much of you there was to want." She took his hand, the calloused farmer's hand that had turned back the dark and receded a valve in the rain, and she drew it to her mouth and kissed the scar, the thin, straight old white line, the mark they had crossed the map to find, the alarm that had woken a galaxy. "Let them wonder," she said. "Let every fleet in the dark lie awake wondering whether the ghost is real. I know the answer. He's real, and he grows melons, and he's mine, and they can wonder about him forever." She smiled, and there were tears in it, and none of them were sad. "Come inside, you ridiculous, impossible, legendary creature. It's not too late for the beans. Nothing's too late. And you're going to drown out here." And the ghost the galaxy had gone to War Alert to find. The door everyone thought was closed forever. The boy who had carried the impossible into the dark and carried it back out, smiled his easy, embarrassed, ordinary smile, and let his wife lead him in out of the rain home, to plant the winter beds, while 3 jumps and 100 sectors away the last red alert on the last listening board blinked once more, uncertainly, and went dark.